Thank you all for coming out to this session today. Hopefully it's useful and as informative as the other sessions you've been to. I know our team has been having a lot of fun hanging out with you all at CMX. So yeah, to kick things off, as we can all tell from this event, community is trending. I think we can all agree that interest in community is higher than ever before. Budgets and team sizes are growing. We're seeing the emergence of tools, dedicated platforms to measure community, to deliver great experiences. And it feels like we finally have a seat at the table. So one question I've been thinking about is this the new normal, or is this a passing fad? And I think the drivers are there for long-term sustained change. I think this is it's about more than the COVID effect. I think bottoms-up go-to-market strategies and product-led growth, these are all changing the game and forcing companies to rethink the traditional funnel-focused processes when it comes to sales and marketing and more. So my question for us today is, where do we go from here? How can the community industry, how can we capture and maintain all of this momentum? Because as we all know, community can be fraught with peril, underinvestment, lack of internal alignment, fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of community. These have all led many companies to attempt and then quickly shutter their community programs. And in fact, according to our own CMX here, only 15% of community teams actually sit inside a dedicated department. And that leads many community programs to be co-opted by the goals of other teams, leading to less than ideal community and the teams that build them. And so I think if we want to lean into the macro level momentum without giving up our souls or our seats at the table, I think we need to reframe the discussion about community's impact on a company. And today I want to share one idea that I think will help you build momentum, build and maintain this momentum inside your company. And so I'm Patrick. I'm co-founder and CEO of Orbit, mission control for your community. And we've spent the past 2.5 years building frameworks and software for community teams. Today, Orbit's used by more than 6,000 community builders who are collectively managing more than 8 million community members on our platform. So needless to say, we've seen a lot of communities, and most of which are just like you. They're community teams inside of companies who are trying to champion the community while driving the business forward. So we've seen all the problems that community teams face, as well as the traits of some of those teams that are building enduring impact. And based on all that, I've really, I've come to believe that to maintain the macro level momentum of our practice, our practice is experiencing, we must build a movement inside our companies. And the good news is this idea of movement building will probably feel very natural for everyone here. You're all community builders and you're great at building and maintaining community with those outside in the community. But my question is, can we do the same inside the walls of our company? Where would we begin if we wanted to do something like that? And I think the movement starts with understanding the cultures of our companies and our unique roles as culture brokers. I think community builders are culture brokers. What do we mean by that? So this is going to get a little academic for just a second here, but a couple of researchers with really interesting names, as you can see there, describe culture brokering as the act of bridging, linking, or mediating between groups or persons of different cultural backgrounds for the purpose of reducing conflict or producing change. So much of this thinking comes from like anthropology and social science and education, where folks have studied this role and context as diverse as Aboriginal medicine, cross-cultural mediation, science education, and things like that. But this description may start to feel pretty relevant for a lot of the community builders in the house today. And they've noticed that culture brokers play several important roles, that of liaison and cultural guide, mediator, and catalyst for change. So in other words, a culture broker is a person who can show up as a member of different cultures and can adapt to the norms and speak the languages and really present themselves as members of culture A and culture B. But they're also really, they're a third culture, culture C. And many companies, you see two cultures separated along these lines. Culture A has been the go-to-market side of things. It's often very quantitative and it's always very commercial. The community B is often very qualitative. It's very people-centric. And often these two cultures feel at odds with one another, like they're speaking different languages. And so I think the maturation is the creation of culture C, and good community leaders embody this. And you can explain both sides to the other, each to each other. You can bridge the conceptual divide. And I think that so much of the process of becoming a mediator and a catalyst for change, it really comes down to language. And I think our choice of terminology can be used as a provocation to jumpstart a conversation. And so one way I think to catalyze a movement between these cultures is to wrap your ideas in the language and culture of your company. So what is the language that the broader business environment is speaking at your place of work? And sadly, I think I'm guilty of this, that we often assume that if we just say something once, even if it's based on observation and lots of data, that people will just internalize it and believe it, after saying it one time. But I've learned that you can't hope that people will just understand an idea on its own merits. Everyone's just really busy. So it starts with understanding and asking yourself questions like, what do people in this company value? And how do they measure what they value? How do they converse about and discuss those things? How do they measure those outcomes and discuss those outcomes? And how is the company structured around these things that the company culture values? And so I think the idea of a go-to-community strategy takes all of this into account, and it will help communicate the impact of community to the rest of the company in terms that it can understand. I think it's vocabulary that all groups can buy into and believe in. It's a bit of business Esperanto, if you will. And it does this by borrowing from the already familiar concept of go-to-market strategy and starting to reframe community in terms of this type of strategic impact. I think every company has a go-to-market strategy. That's indisputable. And I think those companies with enduring impact will also have a go-to-community strategy. And I think it's important because this idea starts to provide a conceptual wrapper around previously seemingly different ideas and teams, like community team and content team and events. GTC starts to wrap these ideas up in one sort of conceptual framework, and it's something the whole community can rally around. And I think the end result is the up-leveling of community in the minds of other leaders across the company, helping them to understand community not as something that's just like company-centric and transactional, but start to reframe it in terms of what community can be. And that's a force multiplier across the entire organization. On a very tactical level, I think it starts to lead to discussions like this. You can imagine having a discussion with the leadership team internally, asking something like, great, how many people are on your go-to-market team? How many people are in your GTM organization? And, it's probably like, 100 or 150. Great. What are all the ways you measure success and impact of your go-to-market strategy? What are the budgets that requires? What are the tools? What is the training? What are the resources? How do you structure yourself such that your go-to-market strategy is effective? And you'll have a fruitful discussion about what that looks like. And then now the next question is something like, hey, is community important? And they probably say, yes, community is really important. Well, how many people in your go-to-community organization? How is it measured? How is it understood? What tools have you deployed to understand your go-to-community? What are the resources you deploy and the budgets that are provided to make sure that GTC is as successful as your go-to-market as well? And so it's a very tactical example here, but you can see how the simple reframe might cause leadership to start to reconsider their point of view on community's relationship to the broader business context. So how do you start thinking about and building a go-to-community strategy? So this is fairly new thinking, I'll say. So we're really starting here with questions and hypotheses, and hopefully we as a community can kind of co-create this alongside each other. And it starts with questions, and there's a lot of questions on the screen. It may be even hard to read, but we've got this little link. If you go to the bit.ly link here, you can actually see all these questions and sort of do a take-home test if you're interested in that. But ultimately, go-to-community provides answers to why do we create a community in the first place? Who is in it? And what's the value to and in between members? And the answers to these questions may seem really obvious to you, but the reality is the audience isn't you. It's everyone else in your organization. And by discussing and arriving at these answers together, you can help educate everyone else on the role of community. Now, note that these questions they seek to understand and measure and influence the community itself. And that's independent from the business objectives. These are about the people in the community and how we're providing value and connection to those people. And so I think this is an important sort of like relationship to understand that a go-to-community strategy is about measuring the community itself, but they do connect to the overall business goals in a deliberate way. And so as we think about putting this into practice, we shift from questions to hypotheses. And those hypotheses start to define and test different ways the GTC impacts the GTM, if you will. And so thinking about all those questions you would have answered on that last screen, you can start to frame up hypotheses about how that connects to the overall business. I think hypotheses are a really good place to start, primarily because communities have to be understood as complex systems. And in a complex system, it means that the connection between your efforts today and the impact of those efforts may happen days, months, weeks, or years apart. And so because it's a complex system, I think we have to approach this as a sort of like a scientific, as scientists essentially asking ourselves questions together. And so just a couple of the examples here start to look at questions like, we think that active community members will retain 50% longer than non-community members in the product. That's a clear hypothesis that you have the data to start to measure and understand. Or we think we can double the output we get from our existing blog by generating 4 community-created posts per month, resulting in a 20% increase in trial signups. And so you can start to see how these hypotheses frame up the sort of relationship between an active community and those business outcomes. And I think just the simple act of discussing and debating these hypotheses and questions should bring more clarity and alignment about the purpose and the impact of your GTC team alongside of your GTM team. And I think it starts to engage people in creative discussions around how to create value in different forms. And so when I think about visualizing the relationship between go-to-community and go-to-market, I think about an ice cream cone, believe it or not. So we're all familiar with the sales and marketing funnel as a metaphor and a measurement device. It's been around forever. In fact, the classic metaphor of the funnel, as we know today, was actually first coined in 1898. And the funnel has been defining and measuring go-to-market strategies essentially ever since. And the thing about the funnel is it's focused on optimizing every step of a process, from awareness to evaluation all the way through purchase. And it's premised on pushing leads through a linear process, extracting value at each stage. Community, on the other hand, it's not about pushing people toward a binary endpoint, but rather it's about creating an environment obviously so compelling that it naturally attracts people toward its center. So in other words, healthy and active communities have high gravity, and a high gravity community is one that excels at attracting and retaining community members. Instead of the funnel, communities should use something like the Orbit model, which is a framework we created, which was created from the ground up to understand and measure communities. By the way, you can visit orbitmodel.com if you want to go deeper into the concepts like orbit level and gravity and love and start to understand how we think about qualitative and quantitative measures of community retention. So just like an ice cream cone, when you pile the scoops of ice cream on top, the second order effect will be that more of that ice cream drips down into the cone. Similarly, as you get better at attracting and retaining your community members, it's more likely that the next appropriate experience for many of them will be to engage in the sales process. I think sales isn't necessarily a 4-letter word. And many times a chat with a great salesperson is exactly what your community member needs at that time. But this idea that quote unquote qualification, it's an outcome, it's a second order effect. It's not a direct goal of the community itself. So I think the go-to-community strategy is what helps build and maintain the gravity while connecting the benefits to company objectives. But community, isn't in itself just another top of funnel activity, but in fact, it's a different system entirely, connected to, yes, but distinct from go-to-market activities. And so one question that often comes up in these conversations is, but really, at the end of the day, isn't community just another form of marketing? Are we talking about the same thing here? And I think it's important to point out that, community and marketing have different inputs and different outputs. In terms of inputs, optimizing a lead flow process is pretty different from hosting meetups and creating educational content. One is clearly go-to-market, one is clearly go-to-community. And these differing activities and inputs naturally lead to different outputs and outcomes. And I think this is where the challenge starts to come in. These activities we're talking about are often carried out by folks sitting inside the same team with the same strategy and the same OKRs. And so you might find situations where the head of revenue, for example, is responsible for defining the goals for a meetup program, or where companies hire a community manager into a large marketing organization and then measure their success based on the goals of everyone else on the team, even if those inputs are very different. And I think this idea of inputs and then outcomes are really crucial for this discussion, because outcomes for go-to-community need to be measured by the growth and retention of the community itself, as well as by less tangible things like number of connections and new relationships and even degree of self-actualization. And incentives are where this all come together. Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome, to quote Charlie Munger. And so, one question to think about today is what is your go-to-community strategy incentivizing? And how does it differ from your go-to-market? And I think the difference between the incentives in go-to-market versus go-to-community strategies can be summarized as the difference between value capture and value creation. I think GTM teams should be measured on the former, while go-to-market or go-to-community strategies should be premised on measuring value creation. Value creation is about informing and educating and entertaining and equipping individuals as independent from the relationship with their business, independent of their business relationship with the company. Whereas like value capture is stuff like demand gen, lead qualification, managing deals, closing pipeline, things like that. And so where are the lines drawn in your company is one thing to consider. And the key here is having the discussion and aligning your teams around who's working on which things. So to sum it up, that was a lot of information really quick. We'll leave time for some Q&A. But some of the key takeaways here, go-to-community should elevate community beyond being simply an add-on, a bolt-on to go-to-market efforts. And I think go-to-community makes clear that community activities aren't simply a top-of-funnel activity, and that community doesn't equal marketing. That the difference between GTM and GTC can be summarized as the difference between value capture and value creation, and that the relationship between go-to-community and go-to-market, they're different, but they're synergistic. And ultimately, my view is that go-to-community can and should be elevated to a first-class competency in the organization alongside go-to-market strategy. And it's a competency which has a team, it has budget, it has toolings, and ultimately has a spot at the leadership table. So I think that if we can start to reframe our ideas in sort of this sort of like higher level perspective around go-to-community, it'll help us maintain the momentum that we're experiencing today and continue driving value for all the folks in our communities. So with that, I will wind down the presentation, and I think we've got about 5 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you, Patrick. Awesome talk, although I think people found it hard to see past ice cream once you showed that graphic. A lot of chat around that. Depending on the time of day, I guess it doesn't really matter apparently to people.
It's lunchtime here. I could go for some ice cream for lunch. So.
Yeah, it's evening here, so I'm all ready for it. Right, let's have a look at the questions. We've got a few minutes. Tamara asks, what's your go-to move for pulling people back, become inactive?
Okay, it's a good question. So I think, thinking back, to this sort of idea of value capture versus value creation, any sort of tactical things like re-engagement, I think can start with kind of like the fundamental question around like what value are we providing? And so I think, you can think about, re-engagement in terms of like a personal outreach, an email or a DM always goes really well. But I think it's always best when coupled with something that's value generating. And, I think that the easy button is kind of like a DM to just check in and say like, hey, thinking about you, how are things going? That can work. I think if we could push ourselves to be creative with that particular type of outreach and couple it with a resource or an invitation to something that we know would create value for that person, I think that sort of re-engagement becomes a lot more interesting. So instead of just saying, I'm thinking about you, saying, hey, I was thinking about you. And also I came across this blog post that's really relevant to community onboarding tactics, which is something that I saw you tweet about a couple of weeks ago. So wanted to make sure you saw it. So, I think if we can bring it back to value creation in all of our interactions, I think that changes the tenor of the type of impact we can have on our communities.
Very cool. We've got a question from Joshua, who loves your hypothesis around GTC's impact on business KPIs and how it can bring multiple stakeholders to rally around investing in a community strategy. So the question is, have you seen how leaders that are successful in aligning stakeholders on GTC are using this alignment to bridge back to securing budget and headcount to drive the community strategy? And how are leaders estimating the cost of building and maintaining communities?
It's a great question. So my favorite example of this in the real world is a company called Datastax. Their chief strategy officer is a guy named Sam Ramji. And I actually interviewed Sam a few weeks ago. We did an event called Community Camp. And there's a link to it that somebody from Orbit can drop into the chat. But yeah, it was like an hour-long Twitter Spaces conversation with Sam on this idea specifically. And I have to give Sam a lot of credit because he's been helping me sort of think through these ideas overall. So Sam is the best example of that. I think that talk with him, he talks about his experiences at Datastax, but also at Google and Microsoft, where he was basically a developer relations executive. He talks a lot about exactly this idea of framing things up. So I'll just recommend that resource. He gets into some specifics of how this is applied. He's my favorite one. Honestly, these ideas, as I said in the talk, are fairly new. You're sort of like, this talk is like, I wrote an article about this, and like this talk is like the first time we're talking about it publicly. So candidly, we don't have tons of examples of like the playbooks and the case studies here. So I realize that's not a very satisfying example or satisfying answer, but I think the chat with Sam Ramji from Community Camp would be pretty useful for fleshing that specific question out more fully.
Great. Yeah, we'll check it out. A question here from Minerva. Do you think it's possible for a bottom-up only approach by staff when executives are not interested in GTC as part of a company's strategy? I guess a lot of people are faced with this challenge.
Yeah, I think it's a process often of that, like cultural understanding and change management, which probably sounds really abstract. I think that, you know, some of it's a bit of a self-reflection on what the company itself values. And so bottoms up in this case, bottom up is a specific type of go-to-market strategy. So maybe I'm missing some of the context, but I think if the company has a community team but doesn't value community, I think that's sort of a tough position to be in for starters. So the question is, do you stay or do you go? Maybe. But I think the sort of the key thing is what do they value? Is it strictly commercial? Can you connect the dots between a more active community and better retention on the product side of things? There's probably some data in your systems to start to unlock that get to the questions that they have. And I think the extent to which you can map your GTC back to whatever like the company level OKRs are, you'll be in a good position. But sometimes it takes more work than others. And it's a bit of a change management exercise to communicate these ideas. It probably takes a long time. So yeah, maybe not a very satisfying answer.
to that for sure. All right, maybe just quickly one more. Steph asked, we've got a small team of 5 people focused on GTC. We're actually part of a GTM org. We have lots of problems answering the who is and who is not in our community. Any tips for when you're missing data or can't correlate data?
It's an interesting question. I'm biased because my company Orbit helps answer this question very easily in many ways. So tooling
did you
is often
plan
the
this
answer.
question?
I did. Thanks, Steph. Let's send Steph some swag. I think telemetry is so important, and it's becoming more and more important. I mean, when we sit down at the table with like the VP sales and like the CMO, they push 3 buttons and get these huge reports from Salesforce and Marketo that look magical. And it, like, sadly, like, it makes them look very effective as executives because they have that data. And if community organizations are lacking that data, it's really hard to just like say, trust me on this. And so we're building tools and frameworks to hopefully make this question easier and easier to get to. If the data doesn't exist, I think I would wonder what platforms are like being used that aren't putting that data, making that data available. But I think the coupling of data and story can be really compelling. So community builders are really good at story often, like we're good at the qualitative stuff and can share the impact that a program had or that a conversation had. I think that coupled with the, oh, by the way, I had that conversation 1,000 times last month, or here are the people I had conversations with, look at how much more active they are in the product. You know, that's how you can start to blend data and story to really craft that narrative in a more, I think, effective way.
Yeah. All right. Thanks very much, Patrick. Really appreciate your time. Really insightful presentation. Yeah. So all the best. Yeah. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of CMX. I think we've got a bit of a break now. So go and do some fun stuff, do some stretching with the yoga, get into the caricature booth, take a pic in the snap bar. Yeah, or go and meet other professionals at the networking tables. Loads to do. So once again, thanks very much, Patrick, and thanks everyone for being so chatty. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy
All right,
the
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.